On October 4th, 1888, a bearded man between the ages of 30 and 40 turned up at George Lusk's house in Alderney Street, Mile End. George Lusk was the president of the Vigilance Committee who attempted to help the police catch Twat the Ripper. This weird-looking man that showed up at his house was then told that Lusk wasn't home, but was at his son's tavern nearby. The same man would then quickly find George Lusk, and this weirdo then starts trying to persuade George Lusk to go into a private room with him. Since George Lusk found this guy's appearance, quote, disturbing and repulsive, he persuaded the guy to instead have a quiet chat with him inside the tavern. As they were chatting, the weird guy then suddenly removes a pencil from his side pocket and then purposely drops it on the floor. He then demands that George Lusk picks up the pencil, to which George Lusk surprisingly does. I think I would have told him to get fucked, but Lusk bends down and picks the pencil up. And as he does so, he notices the weirdo make a swift but silent movement with his right hand towards his side pocket. George Lusk, though, would make it very clear to this guy that he saw him doing whatever the fuck he was doing. At this point, the weird guy just started acting nonchalant and then asked George Lusk where the nearest coffee shop was. Lusk then gave him directions and the weird guy left. George Lusk then thought to himself, what in the actual f*** was that? So he decided to try to trail the guy, but he soon lost him in a crowd in some courtyard. Well, that was weird, but it's only gonna get weirder as we take one last stroll down street for the Jack the Ripper mystery. Welcome back for part 5 of Jack the Ripper and the Whitechapel Murders. Viewer discretion is advised, and please, if you don't want to see nasty shit, look away when you see this countdown thing. Now, 6 days after George Lusk's weird encounter, another suspicious-looking man was seen lurking around outside George Lusk's house. George Lusk then reported this guy to the police, who basically only circulated a description of him. Nothing came of it, obviously, but 2 days later, George Lusk received a letter that reportedly was written in a similar handwriting to that of the Dear Boss letter. The letter read, quote,
"But I'll write you a letter in black ink, cause I have no more of the right stuff."
Now, we've already established that the Dear Boss and the Saucy Jackie postcards were bullshit. Even though it's fake, we should read it properly anyway. The letter said, "I write you a letter in black ink as I have no more of the right stuff. I think you are all asleep in Scotland Yard with your bloodhounds, as I will show you tomorrow night, Saturday. I am going to do a double event, but not in Whitechapel. Got rather too warm there, had to shift. No more till you hear me again, Jack the Ripper." But now, this letter was sent about 2 weeks later and was also most probably a hoax. Why people do this kind of shit is something I'll never fully understand, but yeah, George Lusk must have been somewhat of a celebrity, because he just kept on getting fan mail from Jack the Ripper. The next one said, quote,
"Say, boss, you seem really frightened. Guess I'd like to give you fits, but can't stop time enough to let your box of toys play copper games with me. But hope to see you when I don't hurry much. Bye-bye, boss."
Twat the Ripper. Then on October 15th, a lady named Miss Marsh was working behind the counter in her father's leather shop at 218 Jubilee Street. While she was working, a man dressed like a cleric entered the shop. Apparently, he was interested in the Vigilance Committee's reward poster that was displayed in the shop window, and he asked her for George Lusk's home address. Miss Marsh then told him, "Are you fucking stupid? Why would I know that?" No, I'm kidding. She said, "Go and ask at the nearby Crown Pub." But this man then told her that he didn't want to go to a pub. So then she had to dig through a couple of old newspapers to find a report that mentioned where George Lusk lived. She eventually found one that only mentioned his street name, but omitted his house number. Miss Marsh then read out the address while this guy wrote it down in a notebook. Now, I don't know why, but for some reason, I get some pretty fucking sinister vibes from Cleric Guy and from Pencil Dude. These might, though, just be because of Heath Ledger's Joker and John Wick both weaponizing pencils. But this dude is just writing something in a notebook and for some reason, feels pretty sinister. I don't know. But according to Miss Marsh, this man was of slim build, was about 45 years old and around 6 foot tall. He had a sallow complexion, sallow meaning like unhealthy or pale, and he had a dark beard and mustache. He spoke with what she took to be an Irish brogue. The next day, on October 16th, 1888, A small package wrapped in brown paper and bearing an indistinct London postmark was delivered to George Lusk in the Evening Post. It was addressed to him by name and only had the name of the street on it. It did not have his house number. Ooh, suspicious. This parcel came with a letter inside that said, quote, one more for the road.
From hell, Mr. Lusk, sir. I send you off the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you until the piece of fried and ate it. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife and took it out if you only wait a while longer. Sign, catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk.
Well, this parcel did indeed contain a quote, foul-smelling piece of kidney, but Lusk's immediate reaction was to consider that this was just another sick joke, and that the kidney had been taken from a sheep or some other kind of animal. However, wanting to make sure, he took the kidney to the Vigilance Committee, and none of them shared his opinion that this was a prank. Now, the From Hell letter that I just ruined may be the only real correspondence from the real Jack the Ripper. Maybe. It's another one of those things that's really hard to be sure about. Now, the reason is, when Lusk took this kidney to the Mile End surgery to ask a doctor if it was human, the first doctor that checked it said yes, it is human. This doctor, though, still told George Lusk that he should get a second opinion at the London hospital. This is when he took the kidney to Dr. Thomas Openshaw, who said the same thing. It's real, it's human, and it's from the left side. He also said that this kidney seems to have been removed within the last 3 weeks, from a person who was a considerable drinker and was a woman, approximately 45 years old, and apparently it showed signs of something called Bright's disease. Now, Bright's disease is known today as nephritis, which is an inflammation of the kidneys, particularly, oh man, I'm gonna fuck the pronunciation of this, the glomeruli, and the symptoms are swelling and protein in the urine, and this is often associated with high blood pressure. Anyway, Bright's disease is something that Catherine Eddowes is known to have had. Catherine Eddowes is also known to have had her left kidney removed, and she's also known to have died on September 30th, which was 2 weeks ago, and she was 48 years old, very close to 45. But ultimately, Dr. Openshaw believed that this was just a cruel joke, and it had nothing to do with the Meter Square murder. Also, now doing a little more research, the Bright's disease claim seems to come from motherfucking Major Henry Smith, who we know spoke a lot of shit. So ultimately, it is unclear whether the kidney actually belonged to Eddowes and if this letter was actually sent by Jack the Ripper. This could have just been another one of those coincidences that we keep coming across. And even if it was, Bright's disease was kinda common. Apparently, it was the cause of death of about 1% of all people in the early 1900s. Since we're on the topic of if this letter was real, another sobering coincidence is that if this letter was legit, it's been noted that it was written in a distinct Irish dialect. Joseph Barnett was Irish. Now, what else happened in the month of October? Well, a 7th dead woman was found. Specifically, an unidentified female torso was found in the basement of New Scotland Yard, a police building that was under construction. So the perpetrator was clearly trying to send a message. The message probably being, fuck you. Anyway, this incident was linked to the Whitechapel Murders by the newspapers, who we all know also spoke a lot of shit. So that might explain why it was not included in the Whitechapel murder files by Scotland Yard, and any connection between the two mysteries is now considered unlikely. This case, though, became known as the Whitehall Mystery, and since this series has become way too fucking long already and has literally consumed me for the past couple of weeks, I'm just going to give you the highlight from this mystery and then move on. On the day the torso was found, a psychic named Robert James Lee visited Scotland Yard and offered to track down the murderer using his supernatural abilities. The police then told him to fuck off and called him a fool and a lunatic. I am officially a big fan of Scotland Yard. Now, what else happened in the month of October? Well, I don't know if you remember this guy, Robert Anderson. There is no other explanation. This guy must have surely thought that he was on Dragon Ball Z or something, because it took him 72 episodes to make his grand return. Now feeling rejuvenated and ready to solve the Jack the Ripper case. He failed. Hope Switzerland was nice. Anyway, Robert Anderson was making up for lost time because by the end of October, the police had interviewed more than 2,000 people, investigated more than 300, and detained more than 80. None of them, of course, conclusively linked to the Whitechapel murders. Then, on the morning of November 9th, the 8th woman and 5th and final canonical victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was found extensively mutilated in her room in Miller's Court on Dorset Street. Her landlord, a guy by the name of John McCarthy, sent his assistant, an ex-soldier named Thomas Boyer, to collect Mary Jane Kelly's rent. She was about 6 weeks behind on her rent at the time, owing about 29 shillings. Or if my maths is correct, that's about £240 in today's money. Then shortly after 10:45 in the morning, Boyer knocked on the door but received no response. He then attempted to turn the handle, only to find that the door was locked. Why this motherfucker thinks he can just walk inside a room is beyond the limits of my comprehension, but then Boyer decides to look through the keyhole, but he couldn't see anything. So then he decides to go around the side of the room and goes to the broken window and pushes aside the clothing used to plug the broken window pane. And as this creep looks inside the room, that's when he finds what's left of Mary Jane Kelly lying on the bed. Thomas Boyer then shits himself and runs back to John McCarthy. McCarthy then says, "Bloody hell, mate!" and then runs back with Thomas Boyer to go and take a look at the devastation for himself. He then tells Thomas Boyer to run across to the Commercial Street police station and report the murder to the police. Once Thomas Boyer got there, Boyer managed to say, quote, "Another one! Jack the Whipper! Awful! McCarthy sent me. Oh yeah, let me a quid, bruv." Now I'm not sure if you remember Superintendent Thomas Arnold, but he also finally made his return as well and then gave some orders preventing anybody from entering or exiting Miller's Court. Obviously, it didn't help, but the police also arranged for the news of the murder to be telegraphed to Scotland Yard. News of the discovery of another Ripper victim then quickly spread throughout the neighborhood, and crowds estimated to be bigger than 1,000 people gathered at each end of Dorset Street, and these people were fucking pissed. They were pissed that Jack the Ripper killed another woman and the police did absolutely fuck all about it. The police were about as useful as those nipples on Val Kilmer's batsuit. Pointless and embarrassing. To make it even worse, when these cops got to Mary Jane Kelly's room, they realized that, hold on, this door is locked. How in the blue hell are we going to get inside here now? Well guys, in real time, it's going to take them about 2 hours to figure it out. So while they try to find a way in, let's go over the life of Mary Jane Kelly and see who she was beyond just being the 5th canonical victim of Jack the Ripper. Now, almost everything that is known about Mary Jane Kelly comes from Joseph Barnett. He, of course, got all of this information from Kelly herself, but somehow, some of it still conflicts to the actual things that are known about her or things that other people said. So it is suspected that some, or perhaps most of it, has been embellished. Now, according to both Casebook and Wikipedia, citing what Joseph Barnett said about her, Mary Jane Kelly, also known as Mary Ann Kelly, was born in Limerick, Ireland. When she was still very young, she and her family moved to Wales, the birthplace of the best Batman, Christian Bale. Rob Battenbat was actually also pretty good. Anyway, Mary Jane Kelly is known to have claimed to at least one acquaintance that her parents disowned her, but she was still on good terms with her sister. She described her family to Barnett and others as moderately wealthy, and both he and a reported former landlady of Kelly's named Mrs. Carthy both said that Kelly came from a family of well-to-do people. Barnett reported that Kelly had informed him that her father was named John Kelly and that he was an iron worker, working either in, I cannot pronounce the names of these places, but there they are on the screen, Carnarvonshire, Carmarthenshire. Barnett also recalled that Kelly mentioned having 7 brothers and 1 sister. One brother was named Henry and his nickname was Jonto, and he supposedly served in the 2nd Battalion Scots Guard. She once stated to a friend named Lizzie Elbrook that a female family member of hers was employed at the London theatrical stage. Her landlord at Miller's Court stated that she did receive correspondence from Ireland, although very infrequently. Barnett, however, stated that she never corresponded with her family. Now, back to Mrs. Carthy for a second. She described Mary Jane Kelly as being an excellent scholar and an artist of no mean degree. However, at the inquest into Kelly's murder, Barnett informed the coroner that in the months prior to her murder, she had often asked him to read newspaper reports of the Whitechapel murders to her, suggesting that she was illiterate. Barnett also referred to Mrs. Carthy's house, where Mary Jane stayed for a while, as a, quote, bad house. This fucking guy. Now, when I'm not sure who to believe when Barnett states something to the contrary, I just remember that he once said that he always found Mary Jane Kelly of sober habits. Her neighbors would all beg to differ. Now, in 1879, when Kelly was about 16, she reportedly married a coal miner named Davis or Davies, who it seems was killed 2 or 3 years later in a mining explosion. Now, without any means of financial support, Mary Jane Kelly relocated to Cardiff, Wales, where she lived with her cousin. Now, according to Uncle Joe Barnett himself, with words that actually came out of his own mouth at Mary Jane Kelly's inquest, he emphasized his belief that Kelly's cousin was the source of her leading a life of prostitution, stating, quote, she was following a bad life with her cousin, who, as I reckon and as I often told her, was the cause of her downfall, end quote. Although there are no records of Kelly's presence in Cardiff, Wales, it is at this stage in her life that it is believed that she began her career as a prostitute. Possibly, just like Joseph Barnett said, being introduced to it by her cousin. Then, in 1884, Mary Jane Kelly apparently left Cardiff and relocated to London, where she briefly worked for a tobacconist in Chelsea before securing employment as a domestic servant while lodging in Crispin Street, Spitalfields. The following year, in 1885, Kelly is believed to have relocated to the central London district of Fitzrovia. Here, she met a young French woman in Knightsbridge who helped her get a job in a high-class brothel in the more wealthy West End of London. She apparently soon became one of the brothel's most popular girls, and she spent her earning on expensive clothing and even made enough money to hire a carriage. Reportedly, Mary Jane Kelly was invited by a client named Francis Craig to stay in Paris with him, but she returned to England within about 2 weeks because she didn't like it there. However, it is during this time in Paris that she gave herself the nickname Marie Jeanette. Interestingly, that is what is on her death certificate. Now, it's unclear what changed or what happened in this time period, but pretty soon after this, Mary Jane Kelly moves in with a woman named Mrs. Bookie. Mrs. Bookie lived near the London docks, and in this brief period of time, Mary Jane Kelly and Mrs. Bookie are known to have visited the home of a French lady living in Knightsbridge to demand the return of a box of expensive dresses that belonged to Mary Jane Kelly. Now, this seems to suggest that Kelly's descent into the East End Gotham City lifestyle was quick and sudden, and may have been influenced by her efforts to avoid retribution from a procurer. Procurer is the fancy word for pimp.
No, it's a pimp named Slickback, like a Tribe Called Quest. You say the whole thing. A pimp named Slickback.
Can we call you Slickback for short?
No.
Now, it's also believed that at this stage in her life, Mary Jane Kelly began drinking heavily. But if we believe Joseph Barnett, then maybe she was just drinking water heavily.
So that was a fucking lie.
Kelly then moved from Mrs. Bookie to Mrs. Carthy, and Mrs. Carthy lived in Breezes Hill, Ratcliffe Highway. According to Mrs. Carthy, Mary Jane Kelly lived at her home between 1885 and 1886, before leaving to live with a builder whom Carthy thought Kelly would have actually married. However, she seems to have lived with several different men until about 1886, at which time Kelly was living at motherfucking Cooney's lodging house located in Thrall Street, the very same one that Catherine Eddowes met John Kelly in. Small world, isn't it? Then, on Good Friday, April 8th, 1887, Mary Jane Kelly met the 28-year-old Joseph Barnett while just out and about on Commercial Street, just like I suggested people met last time in episode 4. Presumably, he told her a bit about himself. Joseph Barnett was born on May 25th, 1858 in Harebrain Court, Whitechapel. His parents, John and Catherine Barnett, originally moved from Ireland to Whitechapel, where John took up work offloading ships by the London docks. Some years later, Papa Barnett would become a licensed fish porter in Billingsgate. By 1871, Joseph would follow in his father's footsteps and also get his fish porter's license. Mary Jane Kelly surely told him what she used to do. She worked in a brothel in France and had recently moved back to Spitalfields. Now, as the night went on, they drank more together and they became closer and closer over the course of the evening, and then they agreed to meet again the following day. Now, it's unknown what Kelly was doing for money at this time, but based on what she was doing, it's difficult to see how she would have been doing something else at this point, especially now living in Gotham City, Whitechapel, one of the most fucking toughest places in London. So it's safe to assume that she may have been resorting to prostitution. So something else that's unclear is if Barnett actually paid for his first couple of nights with Mary Jane Kelly. Based on the shit that he would later say with his own mouth, he may have promised to take her away from her horrible life and may have even felt like he was saving her from the streets, as he would later put it. And Kelly could have thought that she was lucky to have found a man with a steady income who was willing to pay for her to live. So whether she really cared for him or not is impossible to know. Whatever the circumstances may have been, after the second meeting, the two of them agreed to live together. At first, Barnett and Kelly lived in George Street, which would be close to Commercial Street. They then moved around to a bunch of different places. Sometimes they were evicted for getting drunk and rowdy, other times they were evicted for not paying rent, but they eventually settled in 13 Miller's Court, 26 Dorset Street. And this would have been around February or March 1888. Then, sometime between July and August 1888, Joseph Barnett lost his fish porter license and money stopped entering the home. It's unclear why he lost his license. Some people have speculated it was drunkenness, some people have speculated theft, some people have speculated that he was just laid off. Nobody really knows why he lost his license, but he did. Pretty soon after this, their relationship started deteriorating, with the couple arguing more and more, and sometimes those arguments even becoming violent. Then at some point, Kelly must have said something along the lines of, you know what, there is no other choice, and she made the decision to go back to prostitution. Otherwise, they would probably end up back on the street. Barnett, though, said no, and according to some witnesses, he would have never allowed Kelly to go back to a life of prostitution, suggesting that this was probably the main cause of their arguments. So understandably, if he did truly like or love her, he must have felt kinda shit about that. Pretty shit. But it seems that there wasn't much that he could do about it. Now, interestingly, around this time as well, the Whitechapel murders began, and they would seemingly end in this very room as well, this 13 Miller's Court, 26 Dorset Street. Now, since we're going to spend a lot of time in this room today, here's a few interesting things to note about it. It was horrifically small. We're talking 12 square feet or 3.7 meters squared, which is smaller than third class on the Titanic, by the way. If you ever go to Belfast, go to the Titanic Museum and take a look at how small the third class rooms were. Interesting thing number 2 is that Mary and Uncle Joe lost their key to the room for an undefined amount of time before the murder, but they were unlocking the door by sticking their arm through that broken window to unbolt it. Specifically, the verbiage used is to bolt and to unbolt it. But you know, as with everything else in the Jack the Ripper mystery, people have been arguing about it online for years. Apparently, this door had a spring latch and would lock automatically when it closed. So if they left it open, it would close itself and bolt. So why she was sticking her hand through the door to bolt it is beyond me, but it is an irrefutable fact that the key was not needed to open this door. All you needed was to know how to do it. However, a squad of police officers couldn't even figure out how to unlock this fucking door without the key, and they had to break it down with a pickaxe. Yeah, it's just another thing that makes no fucking sense whatsoever in the Jack the Ripper story. So can I just pause here to say that it is incredibly convenient that Jack the Ripper just happened to come across 13 Miller's Court and found a prostitute whose window was broken, and he just happened to know how to unlock the door from the outside. Well, Mr. Ian, he could have just went up to Mary Jane Kelly, said, "Hello, love, how long for £2 or whatever," and then just went to her room with her. Well, then why is she the only victim that he did that with? Just pure chance again, right? I sincerely fucking doubt that. And I already explained why in episode 4. But anyway, a German neighbor named Julia Venturni said that Mary Jane Kelly had broken this window while she was drunk. The young lady who was always of sober habits got drunk and broke this window. Now, if you're already confused, here's where things are going to start making a lot less sense now. Now, like I said already, Barnett was recorded as saying some shit that was either wrong or different quite a few times. And we're going to go over a few more incorrect details now. Well, either he's wrong or he just got switched into a different universe where everything is now different. You know, because of fucking Nelson Mandela. On October 30th, between 5 p.m. and 6 p.m., a woman named Elizabeth Prater, who lived in the room directly above Mary Jane Kelly's room, reports that Barnett and Kelly have an argument and Barnett leaves her. Barnett takes lodging at the Buller's boarding house at 24 New Street, Bishopgate, which is about a 6-minute walk away if I've got the right place on the map here. If it's not the right place, it's still stated in multiple sources that this boarding house was a 5 to 10 minute walk away from Miller's Court. Barnett would later state at the inquest that he left Kelly because she was allowing other prostitutes to stay in the room. Barnett said, quote, "She would have never gone wrong again, and I shouldn't have left her if it had not been for those meddling prostitutes stopping by the house. She only let them stay there because she was good-hearted and did not like to refuse them shelter on cold, bitter nights. We lived comfortably until Marie allowed a prostitute named Julia to sleep in the same room. I objected, and as Mrs. Harvey afterwards came and stayed there, I left and took lodgings elsewhere." How motherfucking ever Maria Harvey, who he's talking about, only stayed with Kelly on the nights of November 5th and November 6th, after Barn Dog was already told to leave. So far, this guy said quite a few things that just appear wrong, but we trust his alibi 100% for some reason. Okay, well, let's take a detailed look at what happened in the hours before her death to see if we can figure out what happened here. Before we start, one thing I want to make mention of and call your attention to is the fire in the fireplace that was found when they found Mary Jane Kelly's body, as well as Joseph Barnett's pipe that was above that on the mantelpiece. It has long been speculated that this fire was used to create light so the killer could see what he was doing while he was mutilating Kelly. This idea of him needing to see in the dark all of a sudden, plus the 2 witness accounts of somebody screaming, "Oh, murder!" at 4 in the morning, led the doctors and police to say that Kelly was killed at 4 a.m. Personally, I am not sure. I think they may have made a mistake. But anyway, let's begin the timeline. On November 8th, 1888 at about 7 p.m., Joseph Barnett visits Kelly for about an hour. He finds her in the company of Maria Harvey again. Surely that pissed him off a little bit, because she's arguably the reason that he was told to fuck off. Shortly before he left, friend and fellow Miller's Court resident Lizzie Elbrook shows up to visit Kelly. Now these are the only 2 people that are known to have come by this time, one of which Barnett already knows for sure, that being Maria Harvey, and the other he probably at least knew by name, Lizzie Elbrook, because she lived there, and so did he, and she was friends with Mary Jane Kelly. So in his testimonies, he's talking about a woman that he didn't know. Who is the mystery woman? But again, we trust this fucking guy's alibi. Anyway, Barnett didn't stay for long, and he apologized to Kelly for having no money to give her. Both he and Maria Harvey left Miller's Court at about the same time. Barnett then claims that he returned to Buller's, played some cards with the other residents, and then fell asleep at about 12:30 a.m. Just after 8 p.m., Lizzie Elbrook testified, quote, "About the last thing that Mary Jane Kelly said to me was, whatever you do, don't you do wrong and turn out as I did. She often spoken to me in this way and warned me against going on the street as she had done. She told me too that she was heartily sick of the life she was leading and wished she had the money enough to go back to Ireland where her people lived." The same people, I suppose, that never spoke with her. "I do not believe she would have gone out as she did if she had not been obliged to do so to keep herself from starvation." Lizzie Elbrook obviously referring to prostitution. Then between 8 p.m. and 11 p.m. there are no confirmed sightings, but apparently Kelly had one drink in the 10 Bells public house with a woman named Elizabeth Foster, and then later Kelly was seen drinking with 2 acquaintances at the Horn O'Plenty pub on Dorset Street. This is, by the way, a woman that some websites say had no friends here on Dorset Street and kept to herself. It doesn't sound like she kept to herself to me. Then at 11 p.m., Mary Jane Kelly is seen in the Britannia drinking with a young man with a dark mustache who appears respectable and well dressed. It is said though that she is very drunk. Then at about 11:45 p.m., Fellow Miller's Court resident and prostitute 31-year-old Mary Ann Cox reported seeing Kelly returning home drunk and in the company of a stout, ginger-haired man aged approximately 36. This ginger-haired man was wearing a black felt bowler hat, had a thick mustache, had fucking blotches on his face, and was carrying a can of beer. Mary Ann Cox then follows them into Miller's Court, and she notices that Mary Jane Kelly and Blotchy Face are just standing outside Kelly's door. Mary Ann Cox then passes by and she says goodnight to Kelly. Mary Jane Kelly is apparently kaput and she incoherently says goodnight back to her, and then she says, quote, "I am going to have a song." Now, I'm not sure if Mary Jane Kelly entered her room with Blotchy Face or not, but a few minutes later, Mary Ann Cox hears Mary Jane Kelly singing from her room. Mary Ann Cox is in number 5 Miller's Court, and Kelly apparently was singing the song "A Violet from Mother's Grave." At about midnight, Mary Ann Cox left her room again and she noticed that Mary Jane Kelly was still singing. Then at about 12:30 a.m., neighbor Catherine Pickett, a flower seller who lives near Kelly, is disturbed by Kelly singing. She gets pretty pissed about it and she gets up out of bed and everything, but her husband stops her from going downstairs to complain, telling his wife, quote, "You leave the poor woman alone," end quote. Must have had a thing for her. Then at 1 a.m. it starts raining, and Mary Ann Cox comes home once again to warm herself up. At this time, she notices that Kelly is still singing or has begun to sing again. And unfortunately for the neighbors, she's singing the same song, "A Violet from Mother's Grave." Mary Ann Cox then notices that there was a light coming from Kelly's room, most likely though the candle that she bought from John McCarthy's shop a few days ago. Now, I did call your attention to the fireplace. At the end of episode 4, I mentioned that this fire was said to have been so fierce that it melted the solder between a kettle and its spout. If Jack the Ripper was currently in this room right now, this light would probably be way more intense. This light right now, or this fire, is nothing out of the ordinary. Then at 1:30 a.m., Elizabeth Prater, the lady who lives directly above Kelly, comes back from wherever she was and she goes into McCarthy's shop to chat. At this time, she hears no singing and sees no one go in or out of the courtyard. After spending a few minutes at the shop just chatting, she then goes up to her room. She then pushes 2 chairs in front of her door and goes to sleep without undressing. She is also kaput. Then at about 2 a.m., an unemployed laborer named George Hutchinson, who was a resident of the Victoria Working Men's Home on Commercial Street, had just returned to Spitalfields from Romford. Now, apparently, he's walking on Commercial Street at this point, and he passes a man at the corner of Thrall Street, but pays no attention to him. Then, at Flower and Dean Street, he meets up with Mary Jane Kelly, who asks him for money. Apparently, they knew each other some way or the other, and Kelly had asked him, quote, "Mr. Hutchinson,
I need about $3.50.
What's $3.50?
$3.50.
$3.50?
I said, I ain't giving you no $3.50, you goddamn Loch Ness monster.
Just joking. Kelly had asked him, quote, "Mr. Hutchinson, can you lend me 6 pence? George Hutchinson then replies, "I can't, I spent all my money going down to Romford." Kelly then tells him, quote, "I must go and find some money," end quote. And then Hutchinson watches her walk off in the direction of Thrall Street. Now, according to Casebook, Kelly then meets the man that Hutchinson had passed earlier. This man then puts his hand on Kelly's shoulder and he says something that makes them both laugh. Uncle Hutch then hears Kelly say something like "all right," and then he hears the man say, "You will be all right for what I have told you." The man then puts his right hand over Kelly's shoulder and they begin to walk towards Dorset Street. Hutch then notices that the man has a small parcel in his left hand. Oh no, the last time somebody had a parcel in their hand, a woman died. This is not good. Anyway, just a little bit after this, while standing under a streetlight outside the Queen's Head pub, George Hutchinson manages to get a really good look at this guy. He has a pale complexion, a slight mustache turned upwards at the corner, which he later changed for some reason to a dark complexion and a heavy mustache. This guy also had dark eyes, dark hair, and bushy eyebrows. He is, according to Hutchinson, of Jewish appearance. Now, according to Hutch, this Jewish-looking man is wearing a soft felt hat which he pulled down over his eyes. He was also wearing a long black coat, which had a white collar and a black necktie that was fixed with a horseshoe pin. I don't know what this next bit means, but he wears dark spats over light button-over boots. He also had a massive gold chain coming out the pocket of his waistcoat, and this chain had a large seal on it with a red stone hanging from the end. Again, I'm not really sure what I just said. And one last thing according to Hutch, this guy carries kid gloves in his right hand and had a small package in his left. He's about 5 foot 6 inches tall, or about 5 foot 7, and around 35 or 36 years old. Mary Jane Kelly and this man then crossed Commercial Street and they turned down Dorset Street. Hutch then, having a weird feeling about this guy, follows them closely. Kelly and this man then stop outside of Miller's Court and they talk for about 3 minutes. Hutch then hears Kelly say, quote, "Alright my dear, come along, you will be comfortable," end quote. The man then puts his arm around Mary Jane Kelly and she kisses him. Then she says something like, "I've lost my handkerchief." The guy she's with then pulls out a red handkerchief and gives it to her. After this, Kelly and the guy then keep walking down further into Miller's Court. Hutch just stands there staring at them until he loses sight of them. Apparently he stands there until about 3 a.m. when the clock strikes the hour. Now, George Hutchinson provided the police with such an extremely detailed description of the man right down to the color of his eyelashes, despite it being the early hours of the morning. Therefore, he's become a suspect in a sense, because people think that he lied about what this person looked like. At this point in the story, we've dug through so much bullshit that honestly, who knows what's real and what's fake anymore? We've even had the police themselves embellishing details and facts, and one even claimed to take a fucking shawl from the murder scene. People have then also sent in fake letters with human organs, and witnesses have made up stories to try to sell them to the press. Those are the stories I cut out, by the way, because ain't nobody got time for that shit. Anyway, take all of this with a grain of salt, yeah? Anyway, around the same time at about 3 a.m., Mary Ann Cox once again returns to her room, but this time she reports hearing no sounds and seeing nothing coming from Kelly's room. Presumably, she's in the room with this guy that we just saw now, but apparently it's silent and there's no light. Anyway, Mary Ann Cox then goes to bed, and a little bit later, she thought she heard somebody leaving and walking through the courtyard at about 5:45 a.m. Back to Elizabeth Prater now, the lady who lived directly above Mary Jane Kelly.
Yeah, I know.
As I think I have said 5,000 times in this video already. Now, Elizabeth was woken up by her kitten Diddles walking over her neck. And then she remembers hearing somebody shout, "Oh, murder!" This was corroborated by another resident named Sarah Lewis, a laundress who lived at Miller's Court, and both of them said they heard this sometime between about 3:30 a.m. and 4 a.m. However, in the East End of London, hearing somebody say murder was just about as common as hearing somebody say, "Hello, love." So both Elizabeth and Sarah decided to just go back to sleep after that. But they would later say that it was only one scream, so they took no notice of it. However, the laundress Sarah said she wasn't able to get back to sleep after that, and throughout the night she kept hearing people walking in and out of the courtyard. So that unfortunately eliminates the possibility of catching some footsteps and pinning them on Jack the Ripper leaving the crime scene. But what about the footsteps that Mary Ann Cox said she heard at about 5:45? Presumably, again going on the time that people think Mary Jane Kelly was killed, around 4 a.m., you would assume with the 2 hours needed to mutilate her body to the extent that it was mutilated to, Jack the Ripper would be leaving the crime scene around about now. However, it turns out these footsteps were actually Elizabeth Prater, who left her room at about 5:30 a.m. to go to the 10 Bells pub for a drink. Well, fuck, I guess it was 5 somewhere in the world. Yeah, 5 a.m. But when she left, she saw nothing suspicious. She apparently didn't even see a light on in Mary Jane Kelly's room. Now, the next thing that happens for sure is at 10:45 a.m. on November 9th. Thomas Boyer finds Mary Jane Kelly's body. And now we're pretty much all caught up and we've given the police enough time to figure out how to unlock this door. So at 1:30 p.m. on November 9th, 1888, the police just give up on solving the puzzle and order the landlord John McCarthy to break the door down with a pickaxe. That's correct. The landlord himself could not figure out how to unlock this door without the key. Nor did he have the key. Nobody apparently had the key for this door. Therefore, the only logical explanation here seems to be that Mary Jane Kelly was killed by a client. and it would probably have to be the guy that George Hutchinson saw. However, there was no light seen in the room around the time that Mary Ann Cox passed by at 3 a.m., nor the time that Elizabeth Prater left at 5:30 a.m. So the killer then must have just been chilling in the house in the dark. Or maybe she was killed later. But as I explained in episode 4, if Mary Jane Kelly really was killed around 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, when they broke in her room now at 1:30 p.m., rigor mortis would have set in a long time ago. But apparently it only started setting in while they were examining her body now. And rigor mortis typically takes 1 to 2 hours to start setting in. Now, as I've repeatedly said, take these details or any fact, any fucking information from any of these videos with a massive grain of salt. Because firstly, we know that the police made shit up, and we know that details of the story have been embellished. But, there's nothing else to work with here. So I can either work with their made up details or my own. And I'm not Nuke's top 5 making up bullshit stories, so I'm gonna have to work with their bullshit stories. But as is reported, Inspector Frederick Aberline was one of the first people to go into Mary Jane Kelly's room. And he noted that there was a fire still burning in her fireplace, supposedly fueled by her clothing. And it was even still warm when he touched the grate. This fire was supposedly so fierce, it melted the solder between a kettle and its spout. Now this is very important. Is this an embellishment, or is this a fact? Who fucking knows? But so far we've taken most of these nuggets of information at face value unless they've explicitly been debunked. Like the blood flowing out the public sink in Dorset Street, for example, that one was debunked. This fire thing has not been debunked as far as I can tell. So it would seem that Jack the Ripper did indeed make a fire and fueled it with Mary Jane Kelly's clothes, but the reason why is unknown. In every message board or forum or discussion that I've come across, 90% of the people are saying that he burned the clothes for light, because all of a sudden, this motherfucker needed light to see what he was doing. That's what Inspector Aberline thought as well, because the room was otherwise lit by a candle. The Ripper, who managed to rip 4 fucking women in total darkness before, just needed a little more light this time to see what he was doing. Other people suggest that it was to clean up or get rid of evidence. Again, I ask why all of a sudden? He didn't care before. Well, if we may entertain ourselves now with some tinfoil hat theories, like the ex-boyfriend scorned lover theory, throwing her clothes in the fireplace could have just been pure spite. Now, interestingly, there was something else that they apparently found in the fireplace along with the ashes of Mary Kelly's clothes. They found the brim of a bonnet that belonged to Maria Harvey. If that's true, that means Jack the Ripper threw that shit in the fireplace as well, but for some reason did not throw Joe Barnett's pipe into the fireplace as well, which was sitting in plain view on the mantelpiece over the fireplace. You can kill a man's girlfriend, you can burn her friend's bonnet, but you just can't throw that man's tobacco pipe into a fireplace. Crazy. Now the next thing that happened was that they took 2 crime scene photos and they moved the body to the mortuary. This time I'm going to give you a verbal warning. If you do not want to see this, look away. Pretty soon after this, police physician Thomas Bond and Dr. George Baxter Phillips came over to examine the body, and they noted that rigor mortis set in as they were examining the body. That's the exact verbiage that they used. And to them, this indicated that death occurred sometime between 2 a.m. and 8 a.m. The thing is, rigor mortis, like I said, can start setting in anywhere between 1 and 2 hours after death, with full stiffening being achieved anywhere between 6 and 12 hours. The choice of words here again is a problem, because it's not specific. Did full rigor mortis set in, or did rigor mortis start setting in? No idea. But even putting Mary Jane's death at 8 a.m. seems to be a problem, because the wife of a local lodging house deputy named Caroline Maxwell claimed to have seen Mary Jane Kelly alive and well at about 8:30 a.m. on the morning of November 9th, which is the morning that she was murdered. Now, according to Caroline Maxwell, who lived with her husband at 14 Dorset Street, she had known Kelly for about 4 months. She also knew Joe Barnett, although fair enough, she had only spoken to Kelly on 2 occasions before. That being said, This testimony was printed in the St. James Gazette on Tuesday the 13th of November 1888. The witness saw the deceased at the corner of the court where she lived on Friday morning, between 8 and past. She spoke to the deceased and said, "Why, Mary? What brings you out?" The deceased replied, "Oh, Carrie, I have felt so bad." Kelly was standing against the wall on the pavement. The witness asked her to have a drink, but she refused, stating that she had just had one. On returning from getting her husband's breakfast, she saw Kelly standing outside the Britannia public house about 8:45 in the company with a man. She could not give any description of the man. He was stout and had dark clothes on. Now, as with every other person in this story, her account seems to change slightly the next time she speaks about it. Now, this time, according to a different newspaper called the Wigton Advertiser, this was printed on Saturday the 17th of November 1888. Caroline Maxwell of 14 Dorset Street, wife of lodging house deputy, said she knew Kelly as a young woman who never associated with anyone. Well...
So that was a fucking lie.
Well, this is not looking good. She may have been thinking about somebody else. She saw her standing at the entrance to the court on Friday morning about 8 o'clock. The witness, who had just come out of the lodging house, which was immediately opposite Miller Court, it being an unusual thing to see her up at that time, the witness said, "Why, what brings you up so early?" Kelly replied, "Oh, Carrie, I do feel so bad." The witness asked her if she would have a drink, but she declined, saying that she had just had half a pint of ale, but could not retain it. By the motion of her head, it must have been the Britannia beer shop at the corner where she had had the drink. The witness then left her, went into Bishopsgate to get her husband's breakfast, and on returning, saw Kelly standing outside the Britannia talking to a man. That was about 8:45 a.m. The witness was standing at her door about 25 yards off, and so could give no definite description of the man. He was a short man, dressed in dark clothes, and was wearing a sort of plaid coat. Now, it's kind of the same, but also kind of different, but also gives me the impression that she didn't really know Mary Jane Kelly, and this could have been a different woman. However, she swore up and down that it was Mary Jane Kelly that she spoke with, and the police actually believed her. They just didn't believe it happened on the day that she said it did. Fair enough. However, there was another guy that said he saw her as well, the very same morning, and his name was Maurice Lewis, a tailor that also lived in Dorset Street, and he knew Kelly for 5 years. So him making this mistake seems a little more unlikely. Now, he first reported seeing Kelly and Joe Barnett in the Horn of Plenty public house on the night of the murder. According to Lloyd's Weekly newspaper, printed Sunday the 11th of November 1888, Maurice Lewis, a tailor living in Dorset Street, stated that he had known the deceased woman for the last 5 years. Her name was Mary Jane Kelly. She was short, stout, and dark, and stood about 5 foot 3 inches tall. He saw her on the previous Thursday night, between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. at the Horn o' Plenty in Dorset Street. She was drinking with some woman and also with Dan, a man who sold oranges in Billingsgate and Spitalfields, with whom she also lived up till recently as a fortnight ago. So although they call this guy Dan, it's quite clearly Joseph Barnett. Moving on, he knew her as a woman of the town. One of the women that he saw her with was known as Julia. To his knowledge, she went home overnight with a man. He seemed to be respectfully dressed, but whether or no the man remained all night, he could not say. Soon after 10 o'clock in the morning, he was playing with others at pitch and toss in McCarthy's court, when he heard a lad call out "Copper," and he and his companions rushed away and entered a beer house at the corner of Dorset Street, known as Ringer's. Now, he was positive that on going in, he saw Mary Jane Kelly drinking with some other people, but he is not certain whether there was a man amongst them. He went home to Dorset Street on leaving the house, and about a half hour later, he heard that Kelly had been found in her room murdered. It would then be close upon 11 o'clock. Well. Doesn't that just throw a spanner in the works? Now, this time is several hours after the estimated time of death, and because of this, he was not called to the inquest and he was just ignored. And so was Caroline Maxwell, because these reports did not fit the estimated time of death and they couldn't find anybody else to corroborate this. So they just ignored them. Now, could these two people have been wrong? Yes. Could they have been correct? Maybe? I don't know. I'm gonna give the police here the benefit of the doubt. Caroline Maxwell sounds like she was thinking of somebody else, and Lewis was rushing into a pub, so he could have made a mistake. Neither of these reports are really good, but I am not gonna say that they didn't happen, because there is other shit that just does not make sense. And these two reports, in my opinion, do not necessarily contradict this weird shit that I'm about to talk about. Because I'd like to point out that with the information we have on this story, it is technically possible that Mary Jane Kelly died after the sighting at 10 a.m. and rigor mortis started setting in, like they say in the report, while they were examining her body at 1:30 p.m. But since the post-mortem is so vague, who really knows? That said though, this whole fireplace thing is really pissing in my cornflakes. Let me explain. Inspector Abeline says it's hot when he comes in, but clothing does not burn for hours and hours and hours like this. Furthermore, the clothing in this time period, from what I have read, was extremely flammable, and there are countless stories of women burning to death before the flames could even be extinguished. Here are just 3 examples from the same time period. Number 1, the Archduchess Matilda of Austria. On the 22nd of May 1867, she was standing at a window in the Palace of Vienna, chatting to her young cousin, the Archduke Frederick, when she suddenly felt a burning sensation and she screamed out. Her attendants then ran towards her and found her in flames. They couldn't figure out exactly what had happened because there was neither a fire nor a candle nearby in the room, but her clothes caught fire and she was severely burnt before the flames could be extinguished. Originally, it was believed that she must have stepped on a match which had been carelessly dropped on the floor, but it's now thought that she may have been smoking without permission and that her dress caught fire when she hid the cigarette behind her back. Either way, she died of her injuries because this dress that she was wearing just burst into fucking flames and she couldn't get it off fast enough. Example number 2 is Frances Appleton Longfellow, who was the wife of a famous poet. In 1861, her skirt caught fire in her home and the flames could not be extinguished in time. As a result, she would later die of her injuries. And example number 3 is Mary and Emma Wilde, the illegitimate half-sisters of Oscar Wilde, the Irish author and poet, who both died of burns after their dresses caught fire at a Halloween ball. So tell me, if Mary Jane Kelly really died between 2 a.m. and 8 a.m., is it possible that these ashes from her clothing would still be burning or even still warm? I find it fucking ridiculous that people even suggest that, because as a South African, we have a certain expertise, and that is the braai. Now, we use wood to make coals, and those will last for a good few hours before going out, but they do not last for 9.5 hours. So there is no way in hell that Jack the Ripper is burning Mary Jane Kelly's clothes at 4, and then at 1:30 p.m., 9.5 hours later, they're still burning and still warm. So therefore, in my opinion, this fireplace still being hot is either just another embellishment by the police, or this means that Mary Jane Kelly was probably killed a little closer to 1:30 p.m., probably after 10 a.m., like the witness sightings suggest. Now, even if Mary Jane Kelly's clothes were not highly flammable, they would have at some point self-extinguished, and this would have happened sometime soon after Jack the Ripper stopped feeding things to the fire. Now, if you disagree, that's fine, but it really doesn't matter anymore, because we are probably arguing over fiction anyway, since all of these details have just been embellished over the years, mostly by the police. So now that we're in fucking limbo and we have no idea what time Mary Jane Kelly actually died, let's just move on and get this series finished. Now, Dr. Baghead Phillips believed that Kelly had been killed by a slash to the throat and then the mutilations were performed after death. Dr. Thomas Bond stated in a report that the knife used was about 6 inches long, so about the same as the other Jack the Ripper murders, but he did not believe that the murderer had any medical training or medical knowledge. Dr. Bond wrote, quote, "In each case, the mutilation was inflicted by a person who had no scientific nor anatomical knowledge. In my opinion, it does not even possess the technical knowledge of a butcher or horse slaughterer, or a person accustomed to cut up dead animals." End quote. Now, we have heard this almost every single time somebody got murdered. One doctor, like Baxter or Bagwell Phillips or somebody, would come out and suggest it, and all the other doctors would come out and be like, "Are you out of your mind?" Clearly, there is no evidence that Jack the Ripper has any sort of technical knowledge. So let's just squash this belief right now. Most doctors who saw the victims' bodies did not believe Jack the Ripper was even qualified to carve up dead animals. Now, interestingly, a lot of people say that dismisses Joseph Barnett as a suspect, because him being a fish porter and all, he would naturally be accustomed to filleting fish and deboning them and cutting them, which in reality, he actually would not, because a porter's job was basically just to move the fish, not to fillet them. So it looks like Joseph Barnett is back on the menu. Yeah, anyway, let's move on. Now, I'm not going to go into graphic detail about what Jack the Ripper did to Mary Jane Kelly. It's really, really, really bad. The best way to describe it is it's like that scene from Watchmen. You know, the one where Mr. Manhattan and Rorschach, they're busy talking, and then they're not talking anymore. So it's like that. She was mutilated so badly that the only person who could actually identify her was Joseph Barnett, who identified her by her distinctive blue eyes. Several things of hers were missing, like her heart for example, and most of these parts were never found. However, Dr. Thomas Bond was still able to determine that the last thing that Mary Jane Kelly ate was fish and potatoes. Now, this fish and potatoes has caused something of a debate as well, as you can imagine, because some people are sure that it means that she died at the time the doctors originally believed, and others are sure that it means that she died after breakfast. Personally, I don't really know what to make of it, but I can see where both arguments are coming from. So Dr. Thomas Bond says that he found fish and potatoes in what was left of her stomach and intestines, and a general timeline of how long it will take for this kind of food to move from the stomach to the intestine is anywhere between 2 and 4 hours. So again, it seems however you want to spin the narrative about Mary Jane Kelly's time of death, it seems that the food, it will work if you present it right. So either she died at the time the doctors think, or she died after the witnesses saw her in the morning. Both work, technically. So after they found Mary Jane Kelly's body and they examined it, Inspector Abeline then questioned Joseph Barnett for 4 hours. His clothing were examined, his alibi appeared to line up, and Alibi's investigation appears to have exonerated Barnett completely. So the police did not suspect Joseph Barnett at all. However, when Abeline asked Joseph Barnett if that pipe on the mantelpiece was his, he said yes. However, the pipe was destroyed before it made it to the inquest on November 12th. Why was it destroyed?
I buy a B54.
Nobody knows. There is no satisfying answer to that question. And other than that, there is nothing at all to suggest that he had anything to do with the Whitechapel murders. Not only was he able to convince Inspector Abeline that he had nothing to do with Mary Jane Kelly's murder, but also a few days later at the inquest into her death, the coroner, Dr. Roderick MacDonald, was so impressed with Joseph Barnett's composure as he gave his evidence at the inquest, that afterwards, Dr. MacDonald said, quote, "You have given your evidence very well indeed." Not weird at all. Completely composed when your girlfriend of a year and 8 months was brutally fucking murdered. Yeah. A century after the murder, authors Paul Harrison and Bruce Paley proposed that Barnett killed Mary Jane Kelly in a fit of jealous rage, possibly because she had scorned him. Now, Harrison and Paley also suggest that Barnett committed the previous murders to scare Kelly off the streets and away from prostitution. This is a fairly ridiculous idea, but I can't say that a psychopath wouldn't concoct this crazy plan. However, people are not even sure if Mary Jane Kelly is a real Ripper victim. Her murder is quite a bit different. She was also quite a bit younger, she was killed indoors, and the mutilations are significantly worse. Therefore, there are some people who think that the plot of killing prostitutes to scare Mary Kelly off the streets is a bit too out there, so they've resigned to the idea that Joseph Barnett might have only killed Mary Jane Kelly, and then he mutilated her body to make the crime scene resemble a Jack the Ripper murder. Based on the fact that she was mostly undressed and some of her clothes were folded neatly on a chair nearby, it may mean that she undressed herself before laying down on the bed, which would indicate that she was either killed by someone she knew or believed to be a client. The obvious question then is why would that person be Joseph Barnett, who she just kicked out? Well, again, if we go on things that he actually said with his own mouth, they always made up quickly. However, just because it looks this way, doesn't mean that it actually went down that way. She could have undressed herself like that under threat. Or we could just agree that this was done by some random person who might not have even been Jack the Ripper, who Kelly either let in or this person somehow knew how to get into the room without a key. Now, like I said before, I am not completely against that idea. All of these could just be coincidences, and it could just be the most random story of all time, like an M. Night Shyamalan movie. But this time, M. Night Shyamalan wrote the plot twist after getting blackout drunk on a six-pack of his favorite discount beer. I'm not against this idea at all. However, the big question for me is this. Let's assume that Mary Jane Kelly was killed by the same killer, Twat the Ripper, and Twat knew how to get into Mary Jane Kelly's room because he's been watching her stick her arm through the window. What made him risk this? This room is one way in and one way out. If he's watching her all the time, why is he watching her? And if he is watching her, how did he not see all the other people around her all the time? He would need to know that she's alone, and he would also need to know that she broke things off with Barnett, so that Barnett doesn't come home and interrupt this guy. But not only that, he would also need to hope that she doesn't scream and alert anyone when he breaks in. Not that people respond to the screams anyway. This room could have been a trap. And compared to attacking somebody on the streets where he had plenty of escape routes, this time he would only have one. But he chose to take this risk anyway. So the question is why? What is so special about Mary Jane Kelly that he chose to risk this for him? And again, this just happened to happen 9 days after Mary Jane Kelly kicks Joseph Barnett out. Just another coincidence, surely. Well, anyway, before we end this series off, let's just recap a couple of the highlights. In late July, early August, Joseph Barnett loses his job. Him and Kelly have a big fight, and then she decides to start working again. On August 7th, a woman named Martha Tabram, who lived nearby, is drinking with Mary Ann Connolly and two soldiers. Once they separate, Martha Tabram is stabbed 39 times. This phenomenon is known as overkill, which can often indicate the killer's mental state. Clearly the killer was fucking pissed off about something. Martha Tabram's dress is found raised above her waist, but she's not sexually assaulted. Then 3 weeks later, on August 31st, Mary Ann Nichols, who lived nearby on Flower and Dean Street, is found dead and mutilated, or she is killed and mutilated at 3:40 a.m. by Charles Leachmere in Bucks Row. Her throat is slit twice from left to right, her stomach has been sliced open, and she has been disemboweled. Her dress is raised above her waist, but she is not sexually assaulted. It is noted that there is not much blood on her or even the pavement. Then, a couple days later, on September 8th, Annie Chapman from Flower and Dean Street was killed nearby at Hanbury Street. She was last seen with somebody at 5:30 a.m. who looked 40 years old and foreign. Her body was found later at 6 a.m. with her throat slit twice from left to right. She was disemboweled, some organs were removed, and her killer was seemingly trying to summon Bagagwa. She is found with a torn envelope that could have possibly belonged to Mary Jane Kelly, although that's kind of tinfoil hat territory. Her dress is raised above her waist, but she is not sexually assaulted. Then, on September 25th, the Dear Boss letter gets sent to the Central News Agency. On September 29th, it is forwarded to Scotland Yard. The Dear Boss letter threatens to snip the next victim's ears off. We also know that this letter is fake. Then, on September 30th, Elizabeth Stride is seen with multiple people throughout the night, but at 12:45 a.m., minutes before her murder, she is seen attacked by a Jewish man. 15 minutes later at 1 a.m., she is found dead with a single slash to the throat in Burner Street, Dutfield's Yard, but no further mutilations are found. Then 45 minutes later, on September 30th again, the same evening, Catherine Eddowes is found with a slash to the throat, her stomach opened up, various organs removed, specifically though the kidney is removed, and several mutilations are done to her face. Her dress is raised, but she is not sexually assaulted. Strangely, Catherine Eddowes just came back early from hopping, most likely due to it being a shit harvest and them not making a lot of money, but she came back and said she wanted to claim the reward for the Whitechapel killer. She apparently, supposedly tells a pensioner that the killer is Joseph Barnett and then dies 2 days later. She also lived in the shed right here at 26 Dorset Street by Mary Jane Kelly, and her usual lodging place was Cooney's, where Barnett and Kelly used to live before they got a room together. Surely all just coincidences. And it seems like I'm starting to lose my voice. 2 hours after finding Eddowes' body, the police then find a piece of a bloodstained apron who they believe belonged to Catherine Eddowes, and this apron is lying beneath some graffiti in Goulston Street that reads, quote, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Like I said before, the police have just made up a lot of details here. There's at least 4 different iterations of how this was actually written on the wall. We will never fucking know because they didn't take a photograph of it. Then on October 1st, a full 24 hours after the double event, the Saucy Jackie postcard was given to the Central News Agency, and this letter tries to claim responsibility for the double event. We know now that it is most likely a hoax, written by a journalist who worked at The Star, one of the newspapers at the time, and the motive for writing these fake letters was, of course, to sell more newspapers and keep the business in business. Then, just a few days later, on October 4th, a weird man shows up at George Lusk's house. George Lusk then meets up with this guy. This dude acts really weird, and then soon afterwards, George Lusk receives more fan mail. Most likely, though, all fake as well. Then, on October 15th, a weird man shows up in Miss Marsh's leather shop and asks her for George Lusk's address. The next day, on October 16th, George Lusk receives the infamous From Hell letter. This letter comes with a human kidney removed within the last 3 weeks, and seemingly preserved in spirits, and according to some untrustworthy police sources, shows signs of something called Bright's disease. This would naturally lead people to assume that the kidney actually came from Catherine Eddowes. However, George Lusk and the doctors ultimately rule this letter a hoax. But honestly, who knows? The letter, though, is written in distinct Irish dialect. Joseph Barnett is Irish. Then, at the end of the month, on October 30th, Joseph Barnett and Mary Jane Kelly have a massive fight, and she kicks him out for good. He then goes and gets a lodging house about 6 minutes away. Then, a couple days later, November 5th and November 6th, Mary Jane Kelly allows Maria Harvey to sleep over temporarily. This is one of the ladies that caused the argument between Barnett and Kelly in the first place. Then, on November 8th, Joseph Barnett goes to visit Mary Jane Kelly. Maria Harvey is there. They apparently left at the same time after that. Barnett says that he goes back to his lodging house, he plays some cards, and then he goes to sleep just after midnight. Meanwhile, Kelly is heard singing by a couple of her neighbors. Then at about 2 a.m. she goes out to Flower and Dean Street, she sees George Hutchinson, and then she meets up with a Jewish looking guy and then goes to her room at about 2:45, 3 a.m. Good couple of hours later, Caroline Maxwell sees Mary Jane Kelly at 8:30 a.m. and apparently has a conversation with her. She could have been wrong, she could have thought it was somebody else, or it could have actually been her. Maxwell says she's in the company of a guy who kinda matches Joseph Barnett's description. Although yes, lots of people technically do. Another witness then sees Mary Jane Kelly at 10 a.m., a witness that had known her for 5 years. Then at 10:45 a.m., Mary Jane Kelly is found dead. The police conclude that her most likely time of death was about 4 o'clock in the morning, which would mean for 9.5 hours, the clothes in her fireplace kept burning. Does that sound right to anybody? But more interestingly is what is in the fireplace. They find the brim of Maria Harvey's bonnet, and apparently one of Mary Jane Kelly's skirts. The rest of her clothes is folded neatly on a chair, and her boots are in front of the fireplace. And Joseph Barnett's pipe is on top of the mantelpiece. Now that was just a couple of highlights that I could think of off the top of my head. If you want more, they're scattered throughout the series. Now I've only got 2 final things that I'd like to add. People like to point out that Joseph Barnett was a market porter, and therefore would not have the surgical precision or anatomical knowledge to commit these kind of mutilations. And that's a good point, because most medical professionals agreed that Jack the Ripper did not have that kind of expertise either. A market porter at Billingsgate, like Barnett, would have just moved fish around, not filleted them. The fact the cops let him go because he had no blood on him is another nothing statement. The post-mortems of most of the murder victims state that there was almost no blood on the victim or in the immediate surroundings. And it was even speculated that there would not even be much blood on the killer. And of course, Barnett's alibi doesn't matter because we're not even sure what time Mary Jane Kelly died. Now, I've skewed the story enough to be biased towards Joseph Barnett, so what are some actual problems with him as a suspect? Well, firstly, Joseph Lawend, one of the last people to see Catherine Eddowes alive and to see her with the man that maybe killed her, actually picked a guy named Aaron Kosminski out of a lineup of men. And yeah, we know who Aaron Kosminski was. Now, I don't know if this is important, but Joseph Barnett was not actually offered as an option at that lineup. Aaron Kosminski, though, is an interesting suspect. However, the shawl is a bunch of shit. Problem number 2 with Barnett is that he wasn't Jewish, and most of the victims were last seen with somebody who looked quite obviously Jewish. Now, this could just be racial prejudice because there were some issues at the time, but it doesn't change the fact that Joseph Barnett didn't look Jewish. Problem number 3 is if he actually killed Catherine Eddowes and stole her kidney, where did he keep it? In fact, where did he keep any of the removed organs? My immediate thought is that he could have just gotten rid of them anywhere or even sold them. However, if the From Hell letter is real, then he must have kept Catherine Eddowes' kidney for a while. So how did he manage to do that without being caught? No idea. I mean, a kidney is not really big. I don't imagine it would be incredibly difficult to hide. But yeah, I don't know. So that's a big problem unless the From Hell letter isn't real. On the other hand, though, it does make you think that Jack the Ripper must have been doing something with the organs that he was stealing from these ladies. Even if he had just disposed of them in a garbage bin or something, somebody probably would have come across them even just accidentally, but no one ever did. So why is that? Now, this is where the Joseph Barnett theory goes to crazy town, and I myself am not willing to fully commit and board the train to Crazy Town, but I am aware of some of the Crazy Town itinerary, so I'll tell you what some people think and suggest. Now, some people suspect that Jack the Ripper had an accomplice, and this accomplice kept the quote-unquote trophies. Now, I cannot find a source to back this claim up, but Dr. Frederick Walker states that one of the original suspects, John Pizer, our Z-grade DC villain and the OG Leather Apron, was said to frequent Dorset Street and had a friend named Joe. He then goes on to say, was this friend Joe actually Joe Barnett? And as you all said in my comment section, everybody in Whitechapel had the same fucking name. So it's not a surprise that John Pizer had a friend named Joe. It was basically a guarantee. Assuming he had friends, of course. He sounds kind of weird. Some other people have speculated that the Ripper wasn't working with John Pizer, but was actually working with a doctor named Dr. Michael Ostrog, who was not actually really a doctor, but just some piece of shit con man. Now, this Dr. Michael Ostrog guy would technically match the description of the very weird fucking guy that creeped out George Lusk. And next stop, ladies and gentlemen, Crazy Town. And since Michael Ostrog was in France during the final Ripper murder, i.e. the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, that is why it looked so different. Welcome to Crazy Town. This is about the time I say
so long, and thanks for all the fish.
It's been fun, but now you've lost me. I would agree that the staggering amount of coincidences make me highly fucking suspicious of Joseph Barnett, but as soon as you start trying to explain the other shit away with accomplices or suggesting the Maybrick diary was a hoax written by the real Jack the Ripper to frame James Maybrick, then I just switch off, because this is absolutely ridiculous. I played along with the prostitutes all had the same name, they were potential targets, trying to scare Mary Jane Kelly off the streets, but the rest of this theory is just absolutely ludicrous. Now, if you don't know what the Maybrick Diary is, it is supposedly a diary written by Jack the Ripper, i.e. James Maybrick. In the diary, the author, James Maybrick, makes the claim that he had seen his wife, whom he calls the bitch or the whore, with her unnamed lover in the Whitechapel District of Liverpool. The subsequent rage that he experienced following this sighting sent him on a murderous rampage in the Whitechapel District of London, in the course of which he mutilated and killed 5 prostitutes. Now, up until the emergence of this diary, there had never been any suggestion of a guy named James Maybrick being Jack the Ripper, and the only real evidence against him as a suspect is his own supposed confession, which is this diary. So his viability as a Jack the Ripper suspect depends entirely on whether or not he actually wrote this diary. And if he did, is what he writes about real? Do these correspond with the known facts? But with all things Rip the Jacker, nobody agrees on that once again, and nobody knows if they truly do line up with the facts. But what we do know at least is that the diary first showed up in the hands of a guy named Michael Barrett in 1992. He said, at first, that he got this diary from a friend at the pub the year before. He then came out later and admitted to forging the diary. Good, well at least his conscience is clear. But then he came out later and said that no, he didn't actually forge it, but he got it from his ex-wife who had just divorced him, and this diary had been in her family's possession since the Second World War. And at this point, I don't fucking care anymore. In my humble opinion, it's a big pile of shit. One final thing, since I've spent so long investigating if Joe Barnett could have possibly been Jack the Ripper, or at the very least killed just Mary Jane Kelly, let me tell you one last story of grave spitting. And before you ask, is the story true though? Who the fuck knows? Apparently, according to Casebook, the story begins with a series of British television programs in 1959 hosted by Daniel Farson. The episodes of November 5th and 12th were devoted to Jack the Ripper, and during them, Farson became the first to mention publicly, I am going to butcher this pronunciation, the MacNadden Memoranda, and reveal the initials of Montague John Druitt, the drowned doctor, in a document. As a part of the program, Farson also asked members of the viewing audience to send him any old information they might have on Jack the Ripper, and this resulted in at least one interesting reply. An elderly woman passed on a story that she said her mother had told her shortly before her death. The mother, then a young woman, said that she had been in the cemetery with a friend when Mary Jane Kelly was being laid to rest, and they secretly watched the proceedings. After the service was finished, one man, supposedly Joseph Barnett, remained behind, whereupon he parted the boards covering the open grave and spat onto her coffin. Well, now, as you can imagine, this has also caused a big debate. People have said this would never happen, they would have filled the hole in with soil. Other people have replied, well, clearly they didn't have the time to get around to it, and that is why there were boards covering the hole. No one knows, but either way, I find this an interesting observation, because Joseph Barnett was only really named a proper Ripper suspect in the early 1970s. This story comes from the late 50s. But it's just that, it's a story. But there seems to be a hell of a lot of stories and a hell of a lot of astonishing coincidences around this one guy and the Jack the Ripper case. Murders start when he loses his job, he's on record seemingly hating prostitutes, all the victims are prostitutes who all live very close to him, they all share very similar names in one way or another to his girlfriend. Victim 3, Annie Chapman, is found seemingly holding a torn envelope which could have previously belonged to Mary Jane Kelly. Victim number 4, Catherine Eddowes, lives next door to them at one point in the shed, and then comes back from hopping early, says she knows who the killer is, supposedly, apparently, possibly, says it's this fucking guy, then she's found dead 2 days later. The From Hell letter, the only correspondence from the killer that no one can definitively debunk, also just so happens to be written in an Irish dialect. He has an argument with his girlfriend about a particular prostitute, his girlfriend then kicks him out, and then his girlfriend becomes the final Ripper victim in a murder scene that is particularly different from the others, particularly more violent. And on top of that, this woman that he had a problem with, this prostitute that he had a problem with, her bonnet is found in the fireplace, and his fucking pipe is just sitting on top of the mantelpiece all fine. But don't worry, Jack, the police, they got your back, because they would go ahead and destroy Joseph Barnett's pipe for you. And this, by the way, all happens inside a room that Joseph Barnett used to live in, while the door is locked and not even the landlord or police could figure out how the fuck to get in there. But he would have known because he used to put his arm through the window to unlock it. And then, after his girlfriend gets killed, Jack the Ripper just stops. And don't forget that somebody matching Joseph Barnett's description is then seen spitting into Mary Jane Kelly's grave. A story, by the way, that came from the 1950s before Barnett was ever mentioned as a suspect. But this is all just coincidence.
Guy named Otto Octavius winds up with 8 limbs. What are the odds?
Furthermore, the FBI comes up with a profile for what they think Jack the Ripper would be like. It just so happens to kinda match Joseph Barnett as well. They think that Jack the Ripper would have been a Caucasian male, aged somewhere between 28 to 36. Joseph Barnett was white and he was 30. They believe that Jack the Ripper would have lived and worked in Whitechapel. Joseph Barnett did. He lived in Whitechapel his entire life. They believe that as a child, Jack the Ripper would have had an absent father and a dominant mother figure. Joseph Barnett's father died while he was 6 years old. They believe that Jack the Ripper would have been unmarried. He was, and his girlfriend was a prostitute. They think that Jack the Ripper would have not felt guilt or remorse for his crimes and in a way considered them justified. Well, Jesus Christ, listening to the way that Barnett talks about prostitutes, I wouldn't doubt that. They believe that he would have had a profession in which he could legally experience his destructive tendencies. Well, he was a fish porter, however, he was not necessarily gutting or filleting the fish, he was just moving them around. But he did get occasional work in construction, which does occasionally involve breaking shit, but I suppose it involves mostly building shit. So this one, I don't know, this one doesn't really match. They believe that Jack would have stopped killing because he was either arrested for another crime or he felt close to being caught. Well, Barnett was interviewed for over 4 hours after Mary Jane Kelly's murder. He was never, by the way, questioned about the other murders, so people in the comments saying that he had an alibi for those murders, what alibi are you talking about? Because he wasn't questioned for those murders, he was only questioned for Mary Jane Kelly's. The FBI believed that Jack the Ripper would have had some sort of physical defect, which was the cause of a great deal of frustration. Apparently, Joseph Barnett had a speech impediment called echolalia, where people that have this repeat the last words that are spoken to them. There's a couple of other things in the FBI profile that you could one way or another match to Joseph Barnett. But to be fair, you could probably match it to anybody. Anybody, I guess, that lived in Whitechapel at this time. So ultimately, at the end of the day, do we think that Joseph Barnett was Jack the Ripper or killed Mary Jane Kelly? The answer, I don't know. Is it possible that all of this was just one big massive coincidence? I guess so. I guess it's possible that it is just one huge coincidence. Otherwise then, I feel that I am morally obligated to believe that the 1976 horror movie The Omen was really cursed by Bagagwa. If you're not familiar with The Omen curse, this movie was plagued by so many bizarre coincidences that, you know, I suppose a normal response is to say, yeah, shit, that sounds cursed. But it may only appear that way because we are looking for these coincidences. It's somewhat of a confirmation bias. We are looking for things to prove our conclusion. We're working backwards. We're starting with the conclusion and we're trying to find points and things to fit our narrative. Pretty much like every Jack the Ripper suspect. You got to start backwards. You got to pick a guy and you got to see how much of this shit fits. Now, to prove to you that coincidences mean almost fucking nothing, while they were filming The Omen in 1976, the crew had organized a chartered flight with a particular plane. But then last minute, this plane was rented to another group of people, and then it crashed just after they took off. So far, that sounds like a lucky break for the crew, obviously not for the people in the plane. But it's just the beginning of the so-called Omen curse. The next thing that happens is in September, actor Gregory Peck's plane was struck by lightning while he was flying to London. And so was the executive producer Mace Neufeld and the screenwriter David Seltzers. Now bear in mind that they were all in different planes. To be fair, this is actually kind of weird because on average, each commercial plane gets struck by lightning about once or maybe twice a year, sometimes a little bit more. But to be fair, Hurricane Eloise was also just starting to form at about the same time. And Gregory Peck, flying from California, would have probably flown straight through that hurricane to get to London. I feel it's important and appropriate to mention as well that AC/DC's plane was also struck by lightning in 1990, and that's why we have the song Thunderstruck. And we all know that they should have been struck by lightning every time they flew anywhere because their name literally stands for
Antichrist Devil's Child. Does it?
It came from the back of my sister's sewing machine.
Sewing machine?
Yeah. You know, it's on any electrical appliance. It's power. It just means power.
I'm just joking, don't unsubscribe. It's just a joke. However, while in Rome, lightning apparently also nearly struck the producer Harvey Bernhard. Now, that all sounds pretty spooky. 4 lightning strikes, 4 different people. Sounds like God really wants to kill them, but God missed. That's very weird to me. My question is, how true is all of this? Well, let's let the next coincidence set the bar for how reliable these claims are. The special effects supervisor on the film was a guy named John Richardson, and he had an assistant named Liz Moore, who was a sculptor and an artist. While filming was going on, they were involved in a car crash in the Netherlands, which killed Liz Moore and left John Richardson badly injured. Now, the coincidence is that this seems to reflect a real scene from The Omen that John Richardson had worked on, in which a character is killed in a car crash. The person in the movie is decapitated, and Liz Moore in real life was severed in half. But to make things even more spooky, John Richardson said on TV, quote, "It was certainly very odd because it happened on Friday the 13th. Right opposite the point where the accident happened was an old milepost with nothing but 6s on it. What spooked me even more was when I discovered it was on a road to a place called Omen." End quote. Now, what spooks me is that no photo of this sign seems to exist, despite the fact that there are people who are fans of this kind of shit, who will go to the real locations that movies are filmed at to photograph these things because they love it and they want to go see these things for themselves. People will go to Disneyland. People will go to the Warren's Occult Museum, even though all of that shit inside there is bullshit. People will go there because they like it. The Omen is considered one of the best horror movies ever made. Why is there no photo of this sign? The answer is, of course, because it doesn't exist. I found a blog from a guy named Nivtrick who lives around there who tried to go find it for himself, and he discovered it doesn't exist. You can read the whole blog post for yourself if you want to, it's linked in my description. But there was something in there that I found particularly interesting. He said that around the time that he started investigating the Omen curse, his wife's heart condition acted up and they needed to take her to the St. Antonius Hospital in Sneek. When they were at the hospital, her doctor's name that was treating her was named Dr. Oomen, which sounds a little like Omen. Yeah, so it's baloney, it's hogwash, it's fucking bullshit. And this story happened in 1976, and the truth has already been twisted and manipulated. Now imagine a story from 1888. Now the crew members on The Omen also say something ruined the film roll. 2 different cameras recorded the same faults or artifacts in the film. And the animal trainer who was called in to help with the baboon scene got killed shortly after filming that scene by a tiger at the Windsor Safari Park. Now, one more coincidence for the road and then we'll move on. During this time, by the way, London was under a bunch of attacks and bombings from the IRA, and producer Mace Neufeld planned to eat at a restaurant nearby, but apparently no seats were available after a bomb gutted the restaurant. So what? A dude showing up to a restaurant after it's been bombed is proof that Bagagwa is out to get them. Well, then Bagagwa is a pretty weak demon. Anyway, my opinion is this. Coincidences can be interesting, but they are just that. Coincidences. They cannot be used to prove somebody is guilty. The only thing I cannot wrap my head around is the pipe on the mantelpiece being ignored and the clothes still burning in the fireplace. As far as Joseph Barnett being Jack the Ripper goes, I don't know. I don't think we will ever know. But how the fuck can you just ignore the pipe and the burning clothes? How can we go from just blatantly disregarding a doctor's opinion in the case of Annie Chapman, where the doctor said, I think she died at 4 a.m., but a witness said, I definitely saw her at 5:30 a.m., and everyone's like, yeah, okay, that makes sense because Victorian methods to determine the time of death are pretty unreliable. But then we immediately revert to the doctors are absolutely correct in the case of Mary Jane Kelly, even though they said there was a fire burning right next to her, which probably threw off their calculation even more. And they said rigor mortis set in as they were examining the body. She would have been completely stiff by the time they found her if she died in the early hours of the morning, and that fire would have also self-extinguished if it was started in the early morning hours. Yet we ignore these facts. That is, if these facts are even true, which is what the real problem seems to be. If there's one thing I think everyone can agree on, it's that everything we know about the Jack the Ripper mystery is probably embellished to create a better story. Speaking of, some people don't believe that Mary Jane Kelly even died. They believe that she faked her own death by somehow putting another body there, and that Joe Barnett was somehow in on this because he's the guy that had to identify her. Proof backing this up is, of course, her family from Ireland didn't come down to London for her funeral, because travel was so easy back in 1888. Anyway, what I've learned doing this series and covering the Jack the Ripper mystery is that most of the story is just embellished to hell. And now it's not only impossible to figure out who Jack the Ripper was, but even exactly what happened. In conclusion, nobody knows who Jack the Ripper was, and I don't think we ever will know. I also wouldn't be surprised that if one day, by some sort of miracle, these murders could be solved, I wouldn't be surprised if they were committed by different people. One of them even being angry Joe Barnett himself. Am I convinced though that he killed anyone? Not really. There is no smoking gun in the story. There is no single piece of evidence or clue that the only explanation is yes, that is there because this person killed someone. There's nothing like that in the story. Jack the Ripper left no traces behind. Unfortunately, while making this series, I try to turn over as many stones as possible looking for clues. However, I found none, despite the fact that I'm pretty sure that at least half of the stones are fake stones. So yeah. Now, even though I found the Joseph Barnett theory the most interesting, that's probably because most of it is just bullshit anyway, you know? But anyway, I'm gonna make one more Ripper video after this, just looking at a couple other suspects and the reason people suspect them. I'm just gonna say it again. I don't think we will ever figure it out. It's too long ago, and people have embellished the ever-loving fuck out of the story now, to the point where we cannot even be sure what the actual police investigations said. So on that note, I'm gonna call it here. Feel free, as always, to leave your thoughts and theories in the comment section below, like the video, subscribe for more, and thanks for watching.
So long, and thanks for all the fish.
Salam, salam, salam.